The title of this presentation is "What are the three dominant factors that farmers should focus on to increase profit on dairy farms?" The subtext to my presentation is which are the essential ratios for dairy farmers to monitor if higher profit is the goal, and how do these ratios change when pasture harvest increases, milk production per cow increases, and farm production systems change. At the outset, I'd like to give a big vote of thanks to Standard Bank and Barnbrook for making the webinars possible in these difficult COVID-19 times. This presentation will cover the following. Firstly, I'll describe the background to the data analysis. Then I'll discuss the relevance and interpretation of the statistical analysis. Next, I'll identify a core group of ratios relating to profit. I'll review what the business impacts are of changes to pasture harvest, as well as the business impacts of changes to milk production per cow, and the business impacts of changes to the farm production system, which is to change the percent of pasture in the diet. And finally, I'll draw some conclusions on the factors that farmers should focus on to increase profit on dairy farms. Firstly, I'd like to outline the sources of data that I've interrogated to answer this question. The primary source is a large, comparatively unique, unbiased Australian data set from a single year. This data set includes a wide range of production systems and environments across southern Australia, with the data gathered as part of a range of industry-funded projects, plus industry-funded study groups. There was some data collected by a couple of consultancy groups, as well as directly from Red Sky clients. The year 2005-06 was one when milk price, supplement price, and weather were all within usual norms. The second source is a South African data set that includes 244 sets of data spread over 4 years, from 2014-15 through to 2017-18. One further year of data, 2018-19, was also reviewed, though it was not included in the data analysis. The South African data is primarily from the one consultancy group, Intellect. Although there was some data that was collected independently, the data is also biased to KZN dairy farms. The 4 core years had a range of commodity prices and a range of growing seasons, with 2017-18 being the very high milk price year. 2018-19 was the year with the very low milk price and poor weather, which did make it an outlier and not worth including in the main study. In the pursuit of determining what are the key ratios that correlate with profit, over 140 relationships were statistically reviewed for each country. All relationships of relevance will be discussed here and were published in my recent paper. No relationship of note has not been published. What is the basis of the statistical analysis? I'm going to be showing you a large number of graphs, which will have an equation, an R-squared value, and a p-value. All these graphs utilize US number format rather than South African number format. The R-squared value represents the proportion of the variation on the vertical axis that can be explained by the single factor on the horizontal axis. In this instance, 0,2 or 20% of the variation in return on capital, profitability, can be explained by milk production per hectare. The R-squared value for farm data is unlikely to be very high, because even within a region, there are farms with different land capability, management capability, rainfall stocking rate, and production system. This results in so many factors contributing to profit that it is difficult to single out just one factor as the cause. However, a low R-squared value does not mean that a relationship is not statistically significant, or that it is not important to the level of profit on a farm or for the competitiveness of a dairy industry. The more important point is whether the underlying trend is strong and whether the association represents a causal relationship. Visually, this is seen in the graphs with a narrower shaded area around the trend line, which relates to a lower p-value. This shaded area represents a 95% confidence interval. For an association between two variables, typically a p-value of less than 0,05 is used as a threshold to determine its statistical significance. That is, there is less than a 5% chance that the association has occurred due to random variation. The great majority of the graphs I will present have a p-value of less than 0.001, which means there is less than 1 chance in 1,000 that this association has occurred by chance. This is despite an R-squared value of less than 0.5, which means the trend explains less than 50% of the variation, often substantially less. It may seem counterintuitive that a strong trend does not explain much of the variation. However, it can be framed as a gambling problem and is easier to understand as a result. If you had 2 farmers randomly selected from all farmers in this graph, and you knew one produced 15,000 litres per hectare and the second produced 30,000 litres per hectare and nothing else, how confident would you be taking a bet that the second farmer was more profitable? The answer is not very confident due to all the other possible sources of variation, such as location, management capability, milk contract, land productivity, and a number of other factors. Let us assume for this example that there was a 50% chance that the second farmer with the higher milk production per hectare was the more profitable. Now imagine you had 30 farmers, again randomly selected, producing 15,000 litres per hectare, and 30 farmers producing 30,000 litres per hectare on average. Would you be more comfortable betting that the average profit of the 30,000 litres farmers was more than the average of the 15,000 litre farmers? You should be, due to the chance of winning this bet being over 90%. I'd like to make some comments on correlations and causations. As I've just outlined, correlations or associations between 2 factors can be confirmed through statistical analysis. However, a correlation does not prove a causal link. Causation is more difficult to prove, as it requires further evidence. An argument needs to be constructed to determine the link. Correlations endearing are most often multifactorial, so associations between 2 variables need to be considered carefully for other explanations, or there is a risk of drawing the wrong inferences. A recent paper by Neal and Roach can be used to illustrate this point. The paper was titled Profitable and Resilient Pasture-Based Dairy Farm Businesses in New Zealand. This paper outlined that within a specific region, farmers in the top quartile for return on capital had a higher level of milk production per cow than the other 3/4 of farmers, with the difference being around 340 litres per cow, which was statistically significant. So if the data were graphed with only milk production per cow and profit, there would be a positive trend, and some would infer that higher production per cow was more profitable, and possibly go on to assume that more supplement can be justified to generate the higher level of profit. However, Neal and Roach also reported from the data that the more profitable farmers firstly did not use more supplement per cow, but they did harvest more pasture per hectare, and they did have lower expenses per hectare and per litre, and they did have less capital employed in the business per hectare. All 4 of these factors were statistically significant. On the first point, there was no statistical difference. So a correlation or association between 2 variables may be statistically significant, but may not represent a simple causal relationship. There is another important point to make in regards to this. Significant causal relationships don't reverse when trading conditions change. What will occur is that the trends will flatten or steepen and the tipping points will move. I'd like to demonstrate this principle with a couple of examples from the 5 years of South African data. Firstly, this graph is pasture harvest on the horizontal axis and return on capital or profit on the vertical axis. The results for 2015 in blue and 2016 in red are on the graph. Now I've added 2017 in green and 2018 in orange. The slope of these 2 trend lines are different to each other and different to 2015 and 2016. Remember, 2018 was the year with the very high milk price, which results in a wider variation in management tactics producing a profit margin. For instance, higher feeding rates of concentrate will be more profitable when milk price is very high, so the impact of pasture harvest will be comparatively less. Now watch what happens in 2019 when milk price was very low and pasture growth was poor. The yellow line for 2019 represents the lowest level of profitability and the flattest trend line. When both milk price and pasture harvest are poor, the slope of the trend line would logically flatten as it has. But the causal relationship between pasture harvest and profit does not change. The general shape remains intact for all 5 years. Now let's look at a curvilinear or quadratic relationship. This graph has pasture as a percent of the cow's diet on the horizontal axis and return on capital or profit on the vertical axis. The change in shape, the trend line, between 2015 in blue and 2016 in red is much more pronounced. As you can see, the slope of the two curves are quite different and the tipping point is different. Now I've added 2017 in green. The shape of the curve is quite similar to 2016, although the tipping point is more similar to 2015. Now 2018 in orange has been added. Although the general shape of the curve is similar to the other curves, the usual penalty from decreasing pasture percent in the diet and increasing concentrate percent is not so evident. This should not be a surprise, given this was the very high milk price year, so any profit margin from the feeding of concentrates would have been enhanced. However, the tipping point is similar to 2015-2018. Now I've added 2019 in yellow. In this very low milk price and poor pasture growth year, the curve has been entirely flattened. We don't have a tipping point to identify. Nor is some new relationship created, but economic conditions have been so poor that the normal relationship is not being expressed in the data. Please don't be concerned if you're wondering about how you might position your farm business given these potential changes in slope and tipping point. If you were going to analyze production system options, then this would require that you determine what constitutes an average or normal season for milk price, supplement price, and pasture harvest. Then you plug these values into analysis, as I will demonstrate in webinar 3, and sensitize the results around these values before making a decision on what changes you might implement. So the key message from this is that just as significant causal relationships do not change across years, they also do not change between regions or between countries. What does change is how they are expressed. That is how the slope of the curves and the tipping points might change, with this depending on key commodity prices and the cost and potential quantity of pasture that can be grown. The following slides describe the key outcomes of all the analysis that identified and prioritized the key profit ratios. This is described in full within my recently published paper, presently in press, titled Key Determinants of Profit for Pasture-Based Dairy Farms. There is an additional unpublished addendum that compares all the published Australian data with the South African data. Both of these papers are presently available on the Red Sky website. Mark Neal, Dairy New Zealand's production systems specialist, and Gonzalo Chinon, a colleague of mine from Argentina, assisted me with the data analysis. There would not be time today to fully describe all the key relationships that relate to profit, so I'm going to work through this summary table with you. I've split these key ratios into primary ratios on the left and secondary or proxy ratios on the right. The primary ratios could be considered core to fully describing differing aspects of a dairy business. So these are the ratios that ideally everyone should be monitoring. The secondary or proxy ratios describe a similar aspect of the business to the ratios listed to their left. All these ratios can be used for comparative analysis between farms. There are other important ratios such as return on equity or equity percentage that are specific to the individual business and not included in this presentation. All of the R-squared values are listed in the highlighted columns, with these confirming the proportion of the variation in profitability as defined by return on capital that can be explained by that factor. The left-hand column of R-squared values for the primary ratios are ranked from highest to lowest. All of the p-values are listed in the highlighted columns, with these detailing the significance of the relationship. This confirms that for all of these ratios, there is less than 1 chance in 1,000 that the association with profit has occurred by chance. So all the trends being described are strong. Return on capital is the ratio that defines profit, with this being the return on the value of all assets employed in the business. Profit ratios must reference capital, although profit per hectare and profit per cow only reference a portion of capital, namely the land or the cows. Although these two ratios could be described as proxies for profit, each has substantial weaknesses. Profit per hectare depends hugely on both the productivity and the value of the land. So the profit per hectare required to get, say, a 10% return on capital on irrigated land is very different to what we required on dry land. If this dry land, for instance, has half the potential pasture harvest of the irrigated land. Similarly, the size or capacity of the cows and the total value of farm assets being carried per cow will determine the profit per cow required to attain a specific return on capital. Profit margin ratios are particularly important for quantifying risk and describing how resilient a business is to change in milk price, supplement price, or climatic conditions. Operating profit margin is the more complete measure, as it assesses the margin on every dollar earned, as opposed to just the revenue from milk. Cost of production per litre and total expenses per litre are both excellent total cost measures. Cost of production is considered a more complete measure, as it includes revenue from livestock and other non-milk dairy sales, which offset the expenses associated with these non-milk sales, resulting in a more correct cost of production for milk sales. This methodology allows cost of production per litre to be directly compared to milk price, with the difference being the profit margin prior to debt servicing or other investments. Pasture harvest has the highest correlation to profit, and by a wide margin, compared to all other ratios apart from partial profit and total cost ratios. The next highest correlating ratio to profit is pasture cost per tonne dry matter, and given how fundamental pasture is to dairy farm profitability, this second pasture-related ratio should be included as a primary ratio. This mix of a physical pasture measure and a financial or dollar measure ensures these two ratios provide differing insights into pasture performance. Milk price is a primary ratio, though this needs to be calculated on the basis of energy-corrected milk to have this level of relevance. Milk production per hectare and stocking rate effectively describe a similar impact. As I will demonstrate shortly, milk production per cow within this data set does not explain any of the variation in profit. So all the correlation of milk production per hectare with profit is driven by stocking rate. Supplement cost per litre, which includes concentrates and forages such as hay and silage, and total feed cost per litre, which also includes pasture, have similar correlations with profit. For pasture-based farms, there should already be a couple of ratios being used to monitor pasture production and cost, so it would be logical to use supplement cost per litre to focus on supplements. With feedlot farms, these two ratios would effectively be the same, so total feed cost per litre would be the better choice. This core per cow cost ratio was developed by Red Sky so that a group of costs related to the cows that do not include supplements or people, both of which require their own targeted ratios, could be monitored. Effectively, this provides an opportunity to monitor specific cow cost codes. There are a group of labour ratios that farmers can be encouraged to monitor in different countries, and hopefully these can now be ranked appropriately. The largest proportion of staff time in a dairy business is associated with cows, including milking, feeding, and caring for these cows. So the ratios with the strongest causal link to profit will be those referencing cows. The primary ratio is labour cost per cow, with the labour cost including the cost of management, including an imputed salary for owner-operators. Labour cost per cow and labour cost per litre are similar ratios in structure. So if a second ratio, labour ratio, were to be monitored, then it should be selected from one of these other two ratios. Again, the causal link with cows and profit would mean that cows per full-time staff equivalent would be preferred. There is another weakness with the litre ratios, and that these need to be calculated based on energy-corrected milk to have this level of relevance. This core per hectare cost per tonne dry matter of pasture harvest ratio was also developed by Red Sky, so that a group of costs related to the land area that do not include supplement or people, both of which require their own targeted ratios, could be monitored. This ratio is the most relevant for determining the performance of a dairy business and controlling farm area or hectare costs, which to be relevant and have significance needs to reference the amount of pasture harvested per hectare. Pasture as a percent of the cow's diet is the ratio that describes the farm production system being implemented. The relevance of this ratio will be described in depth later in this presentation. Pasture consumed per cow is a similar ratio in most regards, though would be a secondary ratio to pasture as a percent of the diet. This table now replaces the p-values from the Australian data set with the r-squared values from the South African data. The red highlighted numbers are where there are more significant variations between the data sets that I will endeavour to explain. Firstly, why might pasture harvest have a lower r-squared value in South Africa? Some insight is provided by the higher r-squared values for irrigated and dryland pasture harvest. This graph outlines the results from the two data sets. Pasture harvest is on the horizontal axis and return on capital is on the vertical axis. The trend lines are similar, though the r-squared value for South Africa in green is lower than for Australia in yellow or gold. These two graphs show the separate relationships of pasture harvest to profit, with irrigated pasture harvest on the left and dryland on the right, both for South Africa. The r-squared values are now higher than the 0.24 for the combined pasture harvest, with the irrigated r-squared value lifting to 0.3 and the dryland to 0.37, both much closer to the 0.41 for the Australian data. This confirms the confounding effect of variations in irrigated versus dryland pasture productivity on some ratios within the South African dataset. Although this issue with pasture may go some way to explaining the red numbers, including in relation to stocking rate, there are quite a number of other relationships that require further consideration. An addendum to my published paper, or in it, I more fully describe the bias in the South African data set. However, I'll endeavour to provide an explanation here. This graph outlines the impact of milk production per cow on profit or return on total capital in the Australian data. The relationship is significant and confirms that milk production per cow does not positively correlate with profit. However, very low or very high levels of milk production per cow are likely to reduce profit. I have now overlaid the result from the South African data. Milk production does positively correlate with profit in this data set and quite strongly. However, it is the Australian data that has been collected on a broader and more independent basis. This still begs the question as to whether South African farmers should specifically target higher milk production per cow through higher feeding of supplements, for instance. This graph moves milk production per cow to the vertical axis and has concentrate consumed per cow in tonnes fed per year on the horizontal axis. The relationships are very similar in both data sets. That is, concentrate feeding rate explains a similar proportion of the variation of milk production per cow in both countries. And yet milk production per cow explains very different impacts on profit in the two countries. This should at the very least give you all pause to think about whether targeting higher milk production per cow via increased feeding of supplements is a sound plan. This graph outlines the impact of increasing pasture consumed per cow on milk production per cow in the Australian data. The p-value confirms there is no significant relationship and the trend line is flat. This graph outlines the South African result. The relationship is significant, and unlike in the Australian data, increasing the amount of pasture consumed per cow positively impacts on milk production per cow. You did hear me correctly, and yes, it is the opposite of what most, if not all of you would expect, in that the South African data has a positive correlation between increasing pasture consumed per cow and increases in milk production per cow. This is a good time to remind you that if you cannot causally explain a correlating relationship, then you should dismiss and ignore the correlation. This graph outlines the impact of increasing pasture as a percent of the cow's diet on milk production per cow in the Australian data. The p-value confirms a significant relationship and the R-squared value is quite high. This relationship should sit more soundly and logically with you. Increasing the pasture or the percent of concentrate in a cow's diet with the complementary effect of reducing pasture as a percent of the diet is the surest way to increase milk production per cow, or vice versa. Increasing pasture percent in the diet will most likely reduce milk production per cow. However, when the South African data is overlaid, the relationship is no longer significant, and unlike in the Australian data, increasing the percent of pasture in the diet has no impact on milk production per cow. So some factor in the South African data set is clearly creating a bias in the results. This graph outlines the impact of increasing pasture on milk production per cow in the Australian data. The p-value confirms there is no significant relationship and the trend line is relatively flat. This relationship should also make sense to you, as it is difficult to understand any strong causal link between these two factors. If there was a causal relationship, then potentially a focus on increasing pasture harvest might lead to some increase in pressure on the cows to graze intensively, with this potentially reducing total intake and hence reducing milk production per cow. However, when the South African data is overlaid, the relationship is significant, and unlike in the Australian data, increasing pasture harvest is positively impacting on milk production per cow. It is not plausible for there to be a causal relationship that delivers the South African result. Rather, this confirms the bias in the data set and that the more profitable farmers do harvest more pasture per hectare as would be expected. However, independently of this, this group of farmers have also been producing and maybe targeting higher milk production per cow. What these graphs highlight is how important it is to fully interrogate data and apply science and experience to determine when causal relationships are evident. So although the South African data includes a positive relationship between higher milk production per cow and higher profit, this unexpected increase in profit has primarily been delivered by an increase in pasture harvest and an increase in pasture consumed per cow associated with these higher profit farmers, and not as a result of any more concentrate being fed per cow that would normally be evident. So as we look more in depth at the slides related to pasture harvest, milk production per cow, and production systems, please keep focused most acutely on the golden Australian data. There were a number of ratios identified that were significant but of low or no utility. Milk production per cow is one of those, which I'll be discussing shortly in more detail, though the relevant issue is that this ratio does not positively correlate with profit. This is the same table with R-squared values from the South African data included. Income over feed costs does have some potential application, as this graph confirms, which outlines the impact of income over feed costs per cow on profit. This ratio does have potential weaknesses in that the income is solely milk income and the feed costs are for supplements and do not include pasture. The other issue is that with pasture-based farms, a target income over feed costs will vary monthly and even weekly depending on the potential amount of pasture available. So it is impractical for pasture-based farmers to utilize this ratio, although feedlot farmers could definitely utilize it. Grams of concentrate or grams of supplement fed per litre are other ratios that farmers sometimes utilize. The second graph outlines the impact of grams concentrate consumed per litre on profit. There are multiple weaknesses with this ratio. The relatively flat curvilinear shape of the trend line confirms it is difficult to determine a relevant target amount, and somewhat steeper South African curve has a much wider shaded area, so the confidence level was lower and this data has bias. And just as with income over feed costs, any target level will vary monthly and even weekly, depending on the potential amount and quality of pasture available. so none of the ratios in this table are included in the key ratios list. Now I'd like to have a go at converting the pasture-based ratios to those that would apply to feedlot farms. All of these highlighted ratios would need to be dropped. With the revised feedlot list, including milk production per cow, unlike for pasture-based farms, and potentially income over feed costs, it is logical to include milk production per cow. And this underpins the important structural difference between feedlot farms and pasture-based farms. Feedlot farms are similar to the great majority of commercial businesses, where the primary sale product, milk in this case, is the primary driver of profit. However, with pasture-based farms, it is pasture production that is the primary driver of profit, with the sale product milk being a byproduct from the pasture production process. So now I'd like to look at the wider impacts of increasing pasture harvest. Once again, this graph outlines the impact of pasture harvest on profit or return on capital. The trends are similar and strong in the two data sets, with increasing pasture harvest contributing to an increase in profit. This graph outlines the impact of pasture harvest on profit per hectare. The two trends are similar and even stronger than with return on capital. This graph outlines the impact of pasture harvest on profit per cow. Again, the trends are similar and are really strong. I'm going to run you through quite a lot of graphs and build them into groups of 4. As you can see, the impact of pasture harvest or return on capital, profit per hectare, and profit per cow is similar, with increasing pasture harvest significantly contributing to an increase in profitability. This graph outlines the impact of pasture harvest on cost of production per litre. The two trends are similar and strong, with increasing pasture harvest contributing to a decrease in cost of production. So these are the first 4 graphs. What else does pasture harvest influence? This graph moves pasture harvest to the vertical axis. It has stocking rate in cows per hectare on the horizontal axis. The two trends are similar and strong, with increasing stocking rate significantly contributing to an increase in pasture harvest. This graph outlines the impact of pasture harvest on core per hectare cost per tonne dry matter of pasture. The trends are similar and strong, with increasing pasture harvest contributing to a decrease in core per hectare cost. This graph outlines the impact of pasture harvest on pasture cost per tonne dry matter. Once again, the two trends are similar and strong, with increasing pasture harvest contributing to a decrease in pasture cost per tonne dry matter. This graph outlines the impact of pasture harvest on supplement cost per litre. Again, the trends are similar and strong, with increasing pasture harvest contributing to a decrease in supplement cost per litre. These are the second group of 4 graphs relating to pasture harvest. All of the trends are consistent and strong. What else does pasture harvest influence? This graph outlines the impact of pasture harvest on labour cost per cow. The trend is relatively strong in the Australian data, with increasing pasture harvest contributing to a decrease in labour cost per cow. There was not a similar trend in the South African data, with this primarily linked to the bias in the data. This graph outlines the impact of pasture harvest on core per cow cost. The trend is relatively strong in the Australian data, with increasing pasture harvest contributing to a decrease in core per cow cost. There is not a similar trend in the South African data. This graph outlines the impact of pasture consumed per cow on pasture harvest. The two trends are relatively similar, with increasing pasture consumption per cow contributing to an increase in pasture harvest. The relationship in the South African data set has pasture consumed per cow explaining a much larger proportion of the variance in pasture harvest, which may be worthy of further investigation. This table outlines the impact of increasing pasture harvest. In summary, the primary impacts of increasing pasture harvest on the performance of a pasture-based dairy business are from lower pasture cost per tonne dry matter, lower core per hectare cost per tonne dry matter of pasture, lower supplement cost per litre, lower labour cost per cow, and lower core cost per cow. Changes in these ratios combine to lower the cost of production. Increasing stocking rate plays a significant role in increasing pasture harvest. which underpins the requirement to have sufficient cows grazing per hectare to optimise pasture harvest. This table now includes the South African R-squared values, with the red numbers being those where bias in the data may be impacting on the result. Now I'd like to review the wider impacts of increasing milk production per cow. Once again, this graph outlines the impact of milk production per cow on profit or return on capital. In the Australian data, the relationship is significant and confirms that production per cow does not positively correlate with profit. However, very low or very high levels of milk production per cow are likely to reduce profit. As already discussed, the trend in the South African data is at variance to the Australian data, with this linked to the bias in the South African data set. This graph outlines the impact of milk production per cow on profit per hectare. The trends are similar to those for return on capital for each data set. This graph outlines the impact of milk production per cow on profit per cow. Again, the trends are similar to return on capital. As you can see, the impact of milk production per cow on return on capital, profit per hectare, and profit per cow is similar, with increasing milk production per cow not positively impacting on profitability in the Australian data. This graph outlines the impact of milk production per cow on cost of production per litre. The trends appear quite similar in the two data sets, although the South African data has a significant relationship with milk production per cow, with this explaining a proportion of the variance in cost of production. In the unbiased Australian data set, milk production per cow has no effective impact on cost of production and explains none of the variance in cost of production. So these are the first four graphs. What else does milk production per cow influence? This graph outlines the impact of milk production per cow on core per cow cost. The two trends are similar, with increasing milk production per cow contributing to an increase in core per cow cost. This graph outlines the impact of milk production per cow on supplement cost per litre. The trend is strong in the Australian data, with increasing milk production per cow contributing to an increase in supplement cost per litre. There is not a similar trend in the South African data. This graph outlines the impact of milk production per cow on total feed cost per litre, including pasture cost. The trend is strong in the Australian data, with increasing milk production per cow contributing to an increase in total feed cost per litre. There is not a similar trend in the South African data. This graph outlines the impact of milk production per cow on labour cost per cow. The trend is strong in the Australian data, with increasing milk production per cow contributing to an increase in labour cost per cow. The trend is similar, though weaker, in the South African data. So these are the second set of four graphs. In the unbiased Australian data, the impact of increasing milk production per cow on reducing multiple cost centres is noteworthy. This graph outlines the impact of milk production per cow on pasture cost per tonne dry matter. The trend is strong in the Australian data, with increasing milk production per cow contributing to an increase in pasture cost. Again, there is not a similar trend in the South African data. And finally, this graph outlines the impact of milk production per cow on core per hectare cost per tonne dry matter of pasture harvest. The trend is strong in the Australian data, with increasing milk production per cow contributing to an increase in core per hectare cost. There is not a similar trend in the South African data. This table outlines the impact of increasing milk production per cow. In summary, the primary impacts of increasing milk production per cow on the performance of a pasture-based dairy business are from higher supplement and total feed cost per litre, higher core per cow cost, higher labour cost per cow, higher pasture cost per tonne dry matter, and higher core per hectare cost per tonne dry matter of pasture. The result is that increasing milk production per cow has no significant impact on return on capital, profit per hectare, or profit per cow, other than at a very low or very high level of milk production per cow, where there is a negative impact on profit. This table now includes the South African R-squared values, with the red numbers being those where bias in the data may be impacting on the result. I would add that milk production per cow will have a positive causal correlation with profit for feedlot farms, again reinforcing how structurally different the business, pasture-based dairying, is to feedlot dairying. Now I'd like to review the wider impacts of increasing pasture as a percent of the cow's diet. These graphs outline the impact of pasture as a percent of the diet on profit or return on capital. The trends are similar in the two data sets, and the relationship can be described as one whereas pasture as a percent of the cow's diet decreases, there was initially little variation or impact on profit, although a negative impact becomes increasingly evident as the percent of pasture decreases. The relationship in the South African data set has pasture as a percent of the diet explaining a larger proportion of the variance in profit, which may be worthy of further investigation. This graph outlines the impact of diet pasture percent on profit per hectare. The trends are similar as those for return on capital, although when placed on the same graph, the Australian curve appears comparatively flat. This graph outlines the impact of diet pasture percent on profit per cow. The two trends are similar and even stronger than with return on capital. As you can see, the impact of pasture as a percent of the diet on return on capital, profit per hectare and profit per cow is similar, with decreasing diet pasture percent having an increasingly negative impact on profitability. This graph outlines the impact of diet pasture percent on cost of production per litre. The two trends are similar and strong, with increasing diet pasture percent contributing to a decrease in cost of production. So these are the first four graphs. What else does pasture harvest as a percent of the diet influence? This graph outlines the association between diet pasture percent and pasture consumed per cow. Increasing diet pasture percent is strongly associated with pasture consumed per cow. This graph outlines the impact of diet pasture percent on core per hectare cost per tonne dry matter. The trends are similar and strong, with increasing diet pasture percent contributing to a decrease in core per hectare cost. This graph outlines the impact of diet pasture percent on supplement cost per litre. Again, the two trends are similar and strong, with increasing diet pasture percent contributing to a decrease in supplement cost per litre. This graph outlines the impact of diet pasture percent on total feed cost per litre, including pasture cost. The trends are similar and strong, with increasing diet pasture percent contributing to a decrease in total feed cost per litre. So these are the second set of four graphs. All of the trends are consistent and strong. What else does pasture harvest as percent of the diet influence? This graph outlines the impact of diet pasture percent on pasture cost per tonne dry matter. The two trends are similar again and strong, with increasing diet pasture percent contributing to a decrease in pasture cost. This graph outlines the impact of diet pasture percent on pasture harvest, which is a particularly important relationship to understand. The underlying trends are similar in the two data sets, with increasing diet pasture percent contributing to an increase in pasture harvest. The relationship in the South African data set has diet pasture percent explaining a much larger proportion of the variance in pasture harvest, which is worthy of further investigation. This graph outlines the impact of diet pasture percent on core per cow cost. This trend is strong in the Australian data, with increasing diet pasture percent contributing to a decrease in core per cow cost. There is not a similar trend in the South African data. This graph outlines the impact of diet pasture percent on labour cost per cow. The trend is strong in the Australian data, with increasing diet pasture percent contributing to a decrease in labour cost per cow. There is not a similar trend in the South African data. So these are now the third set of four graphs. Again, the trends are generally consistent and strong, and still there is more. Although these final two graphs highlight the known negative impacts on increasing pasture as a percent of the cow's diet. Firstly, this graph outlines the impact of diet pasture percent on milk production per cow. The trend is consistent and strong in the Australian data, with increasing diet pasture percent contributing to a decrease in milk production per cow. There is no correlation in the South African data, as previously discussed. This graph outlines the impact of diet pasture percent on total dry matter consumed per cow. The trend is consistent and strong in the Australian data, with increasing diet pasture percent contributing to a decrease in total intake per cow. The absence of any correlation in the South African data again highlights the bias in this data. So this table outlines the impact of increasing pasture as a percent of the cow's diet. In summary, the primary impacts of increasing pasture as a percent of the cow's diet on the performance of a pasture-based dairy business are from a lower supplement and total feed cost per litre, lower core per hectare cost per tonne dry matter of pasture, lower pasture cost per tonne dry matter, lower core per cow cost, lower labour cost per cow, and importantly, higher pasture harvest. Changes in these ratios combine to significantly decrease the cost of production. Additional impacts of increasing pasture as a percent of the cow's diet include an associated increase in pasture consumed per cow and a decrease in total consumed per cow and milk production per cow. However, the impact of producing less milk per cow is more than compensated for by the lower costs and higher pasture harvest, resulting in an increase in the level of profit, with the rate of increase reducing as pasture as a percent of the diet increases. This table now includes the South African R-squared values, with the red numbers being those where bias in the data may be impacting on the result. So the three dominant factors to focus on to improve profitability is 1, maximize pasture harvest. 2, optimize the farm production system by targeting a high percent of pasture in the cow's diet. And 3, optimize the execution of farm management in pursuing whatever operational plan you have set for the year. Although I don't have data to support this particular point, I would break it down into 3 factors, including aspiring to have the activities related to pasture, the cows, and other physical activities characterized as being the right action first time, on time. The second factor would be to minimize every cost center within the business wherever possible. And the third factor would be to minimize depreciation, not just by having vehicles, plant, and machinery last for many years, but also critically to minimize herd depreciation by having cows that can survive in the herd for many years, and then keeping these cows in the herd for many years. Cow production is a result of focusing on these 3 dominant factors that impact on profit. And an important question is whether you have a cow that is suitable for maximizing pasture harvest and optimizing the farm production system so that you can optimize profitability. Thank you.